Welcome to Relationship Reset with life coach Dr. Mark Shook. In each podcast, Mark will weave together the ancient truths of Scripture with the latest cutting-edge neuroscience in short, concise, effective, and doable principles and actions to reset your relationship dynamic.
Hi, and welcome to Relationship Reset. I am Pastor Mark Shook. I am your life coach, and I'm going to be walking you through a really interesting part of internal family systems. Internal family system says those little parts that we talked about in the last podcast, there's 3 different kinds, and we're going to look at one of them today, exiles. I'm going to talk about that part of you that carries emotional wounds, trauma, vulnerabilities from our past. They're called exiles because they're often pushed away or hidden by other parts of us that don't want to deal with the pain they carry. So we'll explore how exiles are formed, how they function, and how they influence our behavior, especially when they're triggered. So what are exiles? Exiles are part of your mind that hold on to the most painful and vulnerable feelings you've experienced, often from early childhood. They carry emotions like shame, fear, sadness, or abandonment. These parts are called exiles because they get pushed away or exiled by other parts of our system. For example, if you experience rejection as a child, maybe from a parent, peer, or a teacher, an exile might form to carry the emotional pain of that rejection. It's a soul fragment, split off. And this part of you holds on to the sadness or shame, but instead of dealing with it, other parts of your mind might develop to protect you from feeling that pain if it's too overwhelming. Exiles are typically the parts of us that feel wounded or unworthy. They might believe things like, I'm not good enough. I'll never be good enough. Or I'll always be alone. These are really tough feelings to face, so our mind tries to hide them by creating protective parts like managers or firefighters, we'll get into those later, that keep the exiles locked away. Well, how are exiles formed? Exiles are often formed during traumatic or emotionally overwhelming experiences, especially when we're young. As kids, we rely on our caregivers to meet our emotional needs, things like love, attention, validation. But when those needs aren't met, we feel hurt. The brain, especially during childhood, is very vulnerable to emotional pain, and it creates parts to manage that pain if it's overwhelming. And let's break down how this works with an example. Imagine a child who's rejected by a parent or caregiver. The child feels deep sadness and maybe starts to believe, I'm not lovable or I'm not important. These emotions become too overwhelming, so the brain creates an exile part to hold on to those feelings of rejection. This exile part carries the hurt, sadness, and shame so that the child doesn't have to deal with them all the time. But here's the problem. Even though the exile is locked away, the feelings don't disappear. They're still there. And they can get triggered by situations later in life. For instance, as an adult, someone with an exile related to rejection might feel overwhelming sadness or insecurity in relationships if they sense even a hint of rejection, even if it's not real. This is the exile part getting triggered and bringing all of that old pain, that old emotion to the surface. How exiles function in our minds it's really interesting. You see, because exiles store the most painful emotional memories. These memories might not always be accessible to us because they're lost from our narrative. They've gone from the left side where the narrative is to the right side of our brain, and that's where they're encoded, the memories of that there. They live beneath the surface. When exiles are activated, you might suddenly feel the same emotions you did when the original pain occurred, even if it was years ago. And that's what we call being triggered. Exiles are triggered by situations that remind them of the original hurt. For example, if you have an exile that formed around feelings of abandonment, a simple action like someone not responding to your text might cause you to feel intense fear or sadness, far beyond what the situation calls for as an adult. But the exile is reacting as if it's still in that original situation of being abandoned. And here's the thing about exiles. Even though they're stuffed away in the right side of our brain, they don't stay silent. When they're triggered, their overwhelming emotions can influence our thoughts and actions. You might feel an intense need for reassurance, becoming highly emotional, or even withdraw entirely to avoid facing the pain. That's because the exile is surfacing. And the other parts of your system, like the managers or firefighters that we're going to talk about later, try to suppress it. For example, if an exile formed around the fear of not being good enough, you might have a manager part that pushes you to be a perfectionist, always trying to prove your worth and avoid the shame that the exile carries. In internal family systems, we talk about manager parts and firefighter parts that work to protect you from feeling the pain held by exiles. We'll really dig deep into these in the next podcast, but managers are those parts that are proactive. They try to control situations and prevent anything from happening that could trigger the exile. For instance, if you have an exile that feels unlovable, a manager part might push you to be a people pleaser, always making sure that others like you so you never have to face the exile's fear of being rejected. Firefighters, on the other hand, these parts are reactive. When the exile's pain comes to the surface and managers can't suppress it, the firefighters jump in to numb the emotions quickly. They might cause you to binge watch TV or eat or drink or engage in other impulsive behaviors to distract you from the overwhelming feelings the exile is trying to express. So these protective parts form to keep the exiles hidden, but they can lead to unhealthy behaviors because the real pain isn't being addressed. Instead of dealing with the exile's wound, we end up just using temporary distractions. But here's the good news. Exiles can heal. In internal family systems therapy, the goal is to unburden these exiled parts by bringing them into the open and allowing our central self, our God image self, imago Dei, the calm, compassionate core of who we are, to take care of them. So how do we do this? First, by recognizing exiles. You can't heal until you recognize those exiled parts of you that exist. And this might involve becoming aware of when you feel triggered or when certain emotions seem disproportionate to the situation. Then bring some self-compassion. Once you identify the exile, don't hate it. It's important to approach it with compassion. Instead of trying to push it away or suppress it, you work with the exile by listening to its story, understanding why it feels the way it does. And it's amazing how this happens. And then there's the unburdening. IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy, calls the exile release unburdening. When the exile can let go of that pain and those feelings and realize that now it's not a child anymore, it's safe. And that you, the adult part, are going to watch over it, take care of it. You can handle it. And you integrate it back into yourselves. Exiles are powerful parts of our past that carry those deep emotional wounds. They hold on to our most painful memories. They cause significant distress when they're triggered. But by recognizing, listening to, healing these parts, we can move toward emotional balance and a more compassionate relationship with ourselves. Understanding exiles is key to understanding why we might react so strongly to certain situations or act like we're a child in certain situations, and we can begin to heal those deep wounds. I want to thank you for listening. If this gives you a hope and a clearer picture of by knowing how exiles function, that would be my dream for you. The wounded parts that took the trauma for us, the vulnerable ones that we try to lock up in inner prisons or leave frozen in the past. When you think of those times in your life when you felt embarrassed, grief-stricken, terrified, rejected, whatever, what have you tried to do with those memories, sensations, and emotions? If you're like most people, you've tried to forget about them, to bury them deep in your mind. But think about what others have told you to do about them. As Americans, most of us grew up in one of those cultures that says, hey, just let go, put it behind you. It's over. Most of us have well-meaning friends and family members that said, just get over it. We try to exile the fallout from the dreadful episodes of the past, but in doing that, we're not only exiling memories, sensations, and emotions, but we're also exiling the parts of us that were the most hurt by those events. And sometimes those are the most sensitive, innocent, open, intimacy-seeking parts, which contain qualities like playfulness, spontaneity, creativity. it's not just the traumatized parts of us that we exile. Think about what it was like to grow up in your family. What were the unspoken rules in your family about liveliness and spontaneity, anger or assertiveness? What about your peers? How much were those relationships dominated by parts that wanted to look good to the outside world and needed you to conform to a certain image? The irony is that once you start the exiling process, it reinforces itself. After they're locked away, these exiles can endanger your system or at least impair your ability to function. So you become even more committed to not going there and keeping things at bay. We'll look at managers and firefighters in the next couple of podcasts. And we're going to figure out how to deal with this, how we can get under the surface of that giant iceberg to the 80% and find that healing that we've been longing for. So we're not triggered all the time. We'll see you next time.